Sometimes the greatest mistakes come from the deepest loneliness. When a man has lost everything, his family, his honor, his place in the world, he'll reach for anything that promises meaning, even if it destroys him. Eydor the Wolf-Gripped finds a strange chest buried in the ice of Lake Vargskinn. The big Viking is alone, cast out from his people. The chest has old runes on it. He opens it anyway. A cold light comes out. Back in his village, all the fires go out at once. Children start crying. Old people drop their cups. The sky turns dark. Eydor has made a terrible mistake. He didn't find treasure. He released something that was meant to stay buried forever. Now the dead are waking up under the ice. What will happen to his village now? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Lake Vargskinn like the breath of sleeping giants. Eydor the Wolf-Gripped stood at the water's edge, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the frozen surface. At nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown ox, he was a sight that would have once commanded respect in any Viking hall. Now he commanded nothing but the silence of his own exile. His war-hammer, Bone Crusher, hung heavy at his side. The weapon had been his father's gift on the day Eydor earned his warrior's name, the day he'd gripped a wolf by its throat with his bare hands and snapped its neck to save his younger brother. The memory felt like a lifetime ago, back when the clan Iron Wolf still called him son, back when honor meant something more than the bitter taste of regret. 3 winters had passed since the banishment. 3 winters since he'd failed in the one duty that mattered most, protecting Chieftain Ragnar's boy, young Tormund, during the raid on the Saxon settlement. The lad had been eager to prove himself, too eager. When the Saxon archers appeared on the ridge, Eydor had been wrestling with 2 warriors near the burning granary. He'd heard the boy's cry, turned to see the arrow sprouting from Tormund's chest like a deadly flower. The chieftain's grief had been absolute. The clan's judgment swift. Eydor the Wolf-Gripped became Eydor the Oathbreaker, cast out to wander the wilderness with nothing but his weapons and the weight of his failure. He'd built his shelter in the old forest, 2 days' hard walk from Skjoldholt village. The hut was crude but sturdy, thick pine logs chinked with moss and mud, a stone hearth that threw warmth into the single room where he ate, slept, and tried not to think about the voices of his kinsmen around a mead hall fire. His bed was furs laid over pine boughs. His table was a stump. His company was the wind through the trees and the occasional fox that grew bold enough to steal scraps from his hunting. But even an exile needed to eat, and winter in the Northlands was merciless to the unprepared. The lake had been frozen solid for 2 months now, thick enough to support even his considerable weight. Beneath the ice, fat pike and winter trout waited in the deeper channels. A man with patience and a sharp spear could pull enough fish from those dark waters to last until spring's thaw. Eydor knelt on the ice, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. He'd cut a hole through the frozen surface at dawn, but now the opening was already beginning to skin over with new ice. He broke it again with the butt of his spear, sending fresh chips scattering across the white expanse. The water below was black as a raven's wing, impossibly deep. Lake Vargskinn was old, older than the oldest skald's memory, older than the first stones of Skjoldholt village. The elders said it had no bottom, that it connected to the wells of wisdom in the world beneath the world. Eydor had always thought such talk was meant for children and frightened women. Now staring into that endless darkness, he wasn't so sure. A glint caught his eye. Not the silver flash of a fish, but something else, something that didn't belong in those ancient waters. He shifted position, trying to get a better angle. There, perhaps an arm's length down, something square and dark, rested on what might have been a ledge of stone. Curiosity had always been both his gift and his curse. As a boy, it had led him to discover the hidden passage behind the waterfall, where the clan now stored their winter grain. As a man, it had driven him to explore every unknown valley, every unmarked trail. As a warrior, It had made him reckless, the kind of recklessness that got chieftains' sons killed. He should have left whatever lay beneath the ice alone, should have cast his line in a different spot, caught his fish, and returned to his lonely hut with nothing more troubling than the prospect of another cold night. But the thing called to him with the same irresistible pull that had always driven him toward the unknown. Eydor stripped off his heavy cloak and rolled up the sleeves of his wool tunic. The cold hit his arms like a slap, but he'd endured worse. He plunged his hands into the black water, the shock of it stealing his breath. His fingers searched blindly until they found something hard and angular, metal by the feel of it, but not smooth like worked iron. This was rough, pitted, ancient. It took all his strength to haul the thing up through the hole. Water sluiced off its surface as it emerged, a chest of some kind, smaller than a shield, but heavier than it had any right to be. The metal was black as charcoal, not with paint or soot, but with age beyond counting. Thick roots were wound around it like binding ropes, but these roots showed no sign of rot, despite having been underwater for who knew how long. Carved into the lid were symbols that made his blood run cold. He knew those runes, had seen them in the oldest parts of the burial grounds where no one went anymore. They were from the old tongue, the language spoken before the gods fell silent, before the world grew smaller and the magic faded. Most men of his generation couldn't read more than their own names carved in wood. But Eydor's mother had been a wise woman before she married his father, and she'd taught him the old ways during the long winter nights of his childhood. The runes spoke of binding, of sealing, of things that must never be released. His hands trembled as he traced the ancient symbols. Part of him, the part that still remembered his mother's warnings about things best left alone, screamed at him to throw the chest back into the dark water and forget he'd ever seen it. But another part, the part that had driven him to grip wolves and explore hidden places, whispered that this was why he'd been led here. This was his purpose, his chance to reclaim some measure of the honor he'd lost. The lid was held shut by a mechanism he couldn't understand. Not a lock in any conventional sense, but something that seemed to be waiting for the right touch, the right moment, the right fool to come along and make the choice that would change everything. Eydor the Wolf-Gripped, exile and oathbreaker, made that choice. He opened the chest. The light that poured out was not the warm gold of hearth fire or the clean yellow of sunlight. This was the light of winter itself, cold and sharp and impossibly bright. It rose from the chest like smoke, like breath, like the aurora that sometimes danced across the northern sky. Where it touched the ice, crystals formed in patterns too perfect for nature. Where it touched his skin, he felt a cold so complete it burned. Visions flashed through his mind, images of a time when the world was younger and darker, when kings wore crowns of bone and armies of the dead marched beneath banners of flayed skin. He saw a figure on a throne built from the bones of his enemies, a sorcerer king whose name was whispered in the same breath as curses and prayers for protection. Grimvar the Death-Crowned, the Bone King, the one who had made the dead serve the living until the living begged for the mercy of the grave. The vision shattered as quickly as it had come, leaving Eydor gasping on the ice beside the empty chest. Empty but not powerless. He could feel it in the air around him, a presence like the moment before lightning strikes. Something had been released, something that had been bound for very good reasons. Miles away, in the village of Skjoldholt, Astrid the Wise dropped the bundle of healing herbs she'd been sorting. Every fire in every hearth went out at once, as if the breath of winter itself had blown through every home. In the great hall, old Bjorn the blacksmith let his hammer fall from suddenly nerveless fingers. Children began to cry without knowing why. Dogs howled and horses reared in their stalls. And in the ancient burial ground north of the village, where the old kings lay beneath their mounds of stone and earth, something stirred in the darkness beneath the frozen ground. Eydor stared at the empty chest, understanding flooding through him like ice water in his veins. He had not found treasure. He had not discovered some relic that would buy back his honor or restore. His place among his people he had released, a doom that had been sealed away since before his grandfather's. Grandfather drew breath, the wind across. The lake began to howl. The cold light spread across Lake Vargskinn like spilled milk, seeping into every crack in the ice, every hollow where snow had gathered. Eydor watched in horrified fascination as the frozen surface beneath his feet began to change. The ice grew thicker, but not in any natural way. It pulsed with each heartbeat of the strange radiance, building layer upon layer until the lake looked more like polished stone than frozen water. From the chest, a small object had tumbled free when the light escaped, a runestone no larger than his thumb, carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. The runestone of binding, his mind supplied, though he had no memory of learning that name. It lay dark and lifeless on the ice, its power clearly spent. Whatever spell it had held for centuries was broken now. Its magic scattered to the winds like ash from a dead fire. Eydor reached for the stone, and the moment his fingers touched its surface, the visions returned with the force of a hammer blow to his skull. He saw the binding ritual as it had been performed, wise women and warriors standing in a circle around this very lake, their blood flowing onto the runestone as they spoke words in the old tongue. They had been desperate, these ancient heroes, driven to a terrible choice by an enemy who threatened not just their lives but their souls. The sorcerer King Grimvar had been winning. His armies of the dead had overrun settlement after settlement, adding the newly fallen to his ranks. Traditional weapons were useless against enemies who felt no pain, knew no fear, and returned to fight again each time they were struck down. Only binding magic could stop him, magic that required a willing sacrifice of life force to power the spell. In the vision, Eydor watched the ritual's completion. Grimvar's spirit, torn from his physical form, had been sealed into the chest along with all his accumulated power. The runestone had been the lock, the roots, the chains, the lake itself, the prison. For 800 years the binding had held, until now. The vision released him, leaving Eydor shaking on the ice. He pocketed the powerless runestone and forced himself to stand. The chest felt different in his hands now, lighter, as if its most essential weight had already escaped. When he looked into its depths, he saw not emptiness but absence, like the shape left behind when something terrible is removed from the world. Around him, Lake Vargskinn continued its unnatural transformation. The ice was spreading beyond the lake's borders now, climbing up the banks in crystalline fingers that turned trees to sculptures and rocks to gleaming monuments. Where the supernatural cold touched the water, dead fish began to rise, not floating as they would if the lake had simply frozen too quickly, but standing upright in the ice, their dead eyes reflecting the cold light like black pearls. An unnatural silence had fallen over the entire landscape. No wind stirred the trees, no birds called from the forest. Even the sound of his own breathing seemed muffled, as if the very air had grown thick with dread. The silence pressed against his ears like water, making him want to shout just to prove he still could. But worse than the silence was what came after. From somewhere in the distance, north, toward the old burial grounds, came a sound like the groaning of ship timbers in a storm. Then another and another, until the air filled with the creaking protest of things long still beginning to move. The dead were stirring in their graves, called back to service by the power that had once commanded them. Eydor's warrior instinct screamed at him to run, to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever was awakening in the darkness. But where could he go? His exile had already cut him off from his clan. The neighboring settlements would offer no sanctuary to a stranger, especially one who brought such obvious doom in his wake. And deep in his heart, beneath the fear and regret, he felt the first stirring of something else, responsibility. He had done this. His curiosity, his loneliness, his desperate need to find some purpose in his empty existence, it had all led to this moment. The binding was broken because of his choice. The dead were rising because of his hands on that ancient chest, which meant it was his duty to warn those who would suffer for his mistake. The journey back to Skjoldholt village took him through the heart of the old forest. Along paths he'd walked 1,000 times during his exile, but now the familiar route felt alien and threatening. The trees stood too still, their branches reaching toward the darkening sky like gnarled fingers. Frost formed on every surface, despite the relatively mild weather they'd been having, and his breath came out in great white plumes, as if winter had arrived in the space of a single afternoon. Twice he heard movement in the underbrush, not the scurrying of small animals, but the deliberate footsteps of something large trying to remain hidden. When he stopped to listen, the sounds stopped too. When he continued walking, they resumed after a few moments, always keeping pace, but never coming close enough for him to see what followed him. He gripped Bonecrusher's handle tighter, drawing comfort from the familiar weight of his father's weapon. The war hammer had seen him through countless battles, had saved his life more times than he could count. If the dead were truly rising, he would need all the steel and strength he could muster. The village came into view as the sun reached its zenith, though the light seemed strangely dim and cold. Skjoldholt had been built in a natural depression between two low hills, protected from the worst of the northern winds, but open to the south, where the grazing lands stretched toward the distant mountains. Smoke should have been rising from a dozen chimneys, carrying the comfortable sense of cooking food and burning pine. Instead, he saw only empty air above rooftops that looked oddly dark and lifeless. As he drew closer, the wrongness became more apparent. The village was silent, not the comfortable quiet of an afternoon rest, but the terrible stillness of a place where life had simply stopped. No children played in the common area. No adults moved between the buildings on their daily business. Even the animals seemed to have vanished. No cattle in the pens, no chickens scratching in the dirt, no dogs barking at his approach. The great hall stood at the village's center, its heavy wooden doors standing open as if someone had fled in haste. Eydor approached carefully, his warrior's training keeping him alert for any sign of danger. The silence pressed against him like a physical weight, broken only by the soft crunch of frost beneath his boots. Inside the hall, he found them. The villagers sat or stood exactly where they'd been when the supernatural cold struck, frozen in place like figures carved from ice. Old Bjorn the blacksmith stood beside the central fire pit, his hand still reaching for the poker he'd been using to tend the flames. Astrid the Wise sat at her usual place near the door, a bundle of herbs scattered on the floor where she'd dropped them. Young Kari, barely 10 winters old, knelt beside her mother's chair, her small face turned upward as if she'd been asking a question when the world stopped. But they weren't dead. Not exactly. Eydor could see the faint rise and fall of their chests, the barely perceptible flicker of their eyelids. They lived, but only just, suspended between breath and stillness like insects trapped in amber. The cold light from the open chest had done this. The power he'd released had reached across the miles to touch every soul in Skjoldholt, freezing them in the moment of its awakening. They were prisoners in their own bodies, aware but helpless, waiting for either rescue or the final darkness. And from the north, the groaning sounds were growing louder. Eydor moved through the frozen village like a ghost among the living dead. Each face he passed was a reminder of his failure. Bjorn, who had once shared ale with his father. Helga the Weaver, who had mended his cloak before his exile. Young Kari, whose bright smile had been one of the few lights in his dark years of wandering, all frozen, all trapped because of what he had unleashed. He was examining the strange frost patterns on the walls when movement caught his eye near the village's edge. A figure emerged from behind one of the storage houses, tall, draped in dark robes, moving with the deliberate grace of someone who understood exactly what was happening. Astrid the Wise stepped into the common area, and Eydor's heart nearly stopped. Unlike the others, she moved freely, her weathered face grave but alert. In her hand, she carried a smooth crystal the size of a chicken's egg, its surface glowing with a soft blue light that seemed to push back the supernatural cold. "So," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the unnatural silence, "the Wolf-Gripped returns to us at last. And what gifts does he bring from his wandering?" Eydor's hand instinctively moved to Bonecrusher's handle. You're not frozen like the others. The Sightstone protects me. Astrid held up the crystal, and its light pulsed stronger. My grandmother's grandmother carved this from the heart of a fallen star. It sees through illusions, pierces the veil between worlds, and shields the bearer from certain magics. Her eyes, sharp as winter ice, fixed on his face. It also shows me the truth of what stands before me. I see a man carrying a great weight of guilt, and the stench of ancient magic clings to him like smoke. The accusations he'd expected, the rage, the blame, the demands for answers, didn't come. Instead, Astrid approached him with the steady confidence of someone who had spent her life dealing with forces beyond ordinary understanding. "Show me what you found," she said simply. Eydor hesitated, then drew the empty chest from beneath his cloak. The moment it appeared, the Sightstone's glow intensified, casting dancing shadows across the frozen buildings. Astrid circled the chest slowly, her crystal held before her like a torch. 800 years, she murmured. The binding of Grimvar, the death-crowned. My ancestors spoke of it in whispers, but I had hoped it was only legend. She looked up at him, and her expression held no anger, only a terrible sadness. "Do you understand what you have done?" Before Eydor could answer, the sound he'd been dreading cut through the air, a wet sucking noise like mud being pulled from a deep hole. From the direction of the burial grounds came the unmistakable sound of earth being disturbed, of things that should rest in peace clawing their way toward the surface. "They rise," Astrid said, her voice grim. "The old warriors, the ancient dead, all who fell in battle and were laid to rest in this land. They feel their master's call again." Movement exploded from the forest's edge as the first of them appeared. What had once been a proud warrior of some long-dead clan stumbled into the open, its burial shroud hanging in tatters from bones held together by supernatural will. Empty. Eye sockets turned toward the village with unmistakable purpose, and more shapes emerged behind it, dozens of them, shambling with the horrible parody of life that death magic granted. "Stand ready!" Astrid commanded, but her words were interrupted by angry shouts from the village center. Bjorn the blacksmith burst from the great hall, his massive frame moving with surprising speed for a man of his years. Behind him came others, those villagers strong enough to break free from the supernatural stupor that had claimed their neighbors. They carried weapons hastily grabbed from wherever they could find them, hammers, axes, even kitchen knives gripped in trembling hands. "There!" Bjorn's voice boomed across the common area as he spotted Eydor. "There stands the cause of our doom. Seize him!" The blacksmith charged forward, his warhammer raised high. Others followed, Eric the hunter with his long bow, Gunnar the shipwright wielding a cruel-looking boat-hook. 3 or 4 younger men whose names Eydor didn't know, but whose intent was clear enough. Eydor made no move to defend himself. These people had every right to their anger. He had brought this catastrophe down upon them, and if they chose to exact justice with their own hands, he would not deny them that satisfaction. But Astrid stepped between them, her sightstone blazing with cold fire. "Hold!" she commanded, and something in her voice made even Bjorn pause mid-stride. "Would you spend your strength fighting each other while the true enemy gathers at our gates?" She gestured toward the forest, where more of the dead emerged with each passing moment. Some were ancient warriors in rusted mail, others were farmers and fishermen who had died in their beds generations ago. All moved with the same terrible purpose, drawn by the power that had awakened them. "The exile may have caused this," Astrid continued, her words cutting through the villagers' rage like a blade. "But he is also our best hope of ending it. Look at him, truly look. When did any of you last see a man who could stand against a dozen armed foes without fear? When did you last see shoulders that could bear the weight of a village's survival?" Young Kari pushed through the crowd of adults, her small face streaked with tears, but her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "He saved me from the wolves last winter," she said, her child's voice carrying clearly in the tense air. "When I was lost in the forest and the pack cornered me by the old oak tree, he came out of nowhere and fought them off with his bare hands." Eydor started, He remembered the incident. He'd been hunting when he heard the child's screams, had driven off the wolf pack without thinking. But he'd slipped away before anyone could see him, not wanting to complicate the girl's rescue with questions about his presence so close to the village. "I never told anyone," Kari continued, looking up at him with those bright, trusting eyes. "But I knew it was you. You have kind eyes, even when you're trying to look fierce." The simple words hit him harder than any weapon could have. This child, this innocent girl who had no reason to trust him, had kept his secret for an entire winter, protecting him even as he protected her. Bjorn lowered his hammer slightly, confusion replacing rage on his weathered features. "Is this true, child?" "It's true," Kari said firmly. "And if he could save me from wolves, maybe he can save all of us from whatever those things are." She pointed toward the approaching dead, and the villagers turned to see the full scope of what they faced. Dozens had become scores, scores were becoming hundreds. The ancient burial grounds had been extensive, holding generations of the honored dead. Now all of them were answering an old master's call. Astrid nodded approvingly at the child's words. "The girl speaks wisdom beyond her years. We have little time and fewer choices. We can waste our strength on vengeance, or we can use it to survive what comes next." The groaning of the dead grew louder, closer. Soon they would reach the villages, outer buildings, and then the real battle would begin. The first wave of the dead crashed against Skjoldholt's outer defenses like a tide of bones and rusted iron. What had once been proud warriors in life moved with jerky, unnatural motions, their ancient weapons still clutched in skeletal hands. They felt no pain when the villagers' blades found their mark, showed no fear when flames licked at their burial shrouds. Only complete dismemberment seemed to stop them, and even then, severed limbs continued to twitch and grasp with horrible persistence. Eydor found himself fighting beside the very men who had moments before wanted to string him up. Survival made strange allies of former enemies. His warhammer bone crusher sang through the air, shattering ancient skulls and splintering ribs that had lain quiet for centuries. The familiar weight of the weapon in his hands, the rhythm of battle, the clear purpose of defending the innocent, it all felt like coming home after a long, cold journey. Bjorn fought at his left side, the blacksmith's massive hammer proving devastating against opponents who required complete destruction to stay down. "I still say this is your fault, exile," Bjorn grunted between swings, "but I'll be damned if I let these abominations take my village while I still draw breath." "Agreed," Eydor replied, crushing the skull of what had once been a Saxon raider buried in Ironwolf lands generations ago. "When this is over, you can have your satisfaction, but not while children need protection." The mention of children drew both their eyes to where young Kari huddled with the other villagers in the great hall. The child's pendant, a simple wooden carving of a tree that her grandmother had made, was glowing with the same soft light as Astrid's sightstone, creating a protective circle around the non-combatants. Neither man had time to wonder at this strange development as another group of the dead pressed forward. Astrid moved through the battle like a dancer, her sightstone revealing the supernatural threads that animated their enemies. "Aim for the joining points," she called out, her voice carrying over the clash of weapons. "Where the magic binds bone to bone, there! Strike there!" Her guidance proved invaluable. Following her directions, the defenders found they could disable their opponents more efficiently, though the sheer numbers remained overwhelming. For Dastas, every ancient warrior they put down, 2 more emerged from the forest. The burial grounds had been vast, accumulating the honored dead of dozens of clans over countless generations. It was during a brief lull in the fighting that Astrid made her most disturbing discovery. Kneeling beside one of the fallen dead, she held her sightstone close to examine the supernatural energies that had animated it. What she saw made her blood run cold. "They're being reformed," she announced, her voice tight with concern. "Not just awakened, rebuilt. Something is gathering the scattered pieces of an ancient power and forging them into a new whole." As if, summoned by her words, a new presence made itself known on the battlefield. From the direction of the old burial mounds came a figure that stood head and shoulders above the shambling dead. This had once been a giant of a man, a chieftain or war leader, whose burial mound had been the largest in the ancient cemetery. Unlike the others, this one retained some semblance of its former majesty, tattered remains of a rich cloak, the gleam of gold arm rings, and most disturbing of all, a partially reformed crown of blackened metal that seemed to pull darkness toward itself. The Sorcerer King's crown fragment had found its first bearer. The giant strode through the ranks of lesser dead, and where it passed, they stood straighter, moved with greater purpose. Its empty eye sockets fixed on the village, and when it raised one massive arm, every one of the undead stopped their advance and turned toward their temporary master. Grimvar, Astrid whispered, the name falling from her lips like a curse. He seeks to rebuild himself piece by piece, using the strongest of the dead as vessels for his returning power. The crown-bearer opened its mouth and spoke, though the voice that emerged was not its own, but something far older and more terrible. The words were in the old tongue, but their meaning was clear enough. A demand for surrender, a promise of eternal service, a threat that made the very air seem to thicken with dread. Eydor stepped forward, raising Bone Crusher high enough for all to see. "I am Eydor Iron Wolfson," he called out, using his true clan name for the first time since his exile. "I opened your prison, spirit, and I will be the one to close it again." The crown-bearer's attention focused on him with the weight of a landslide. When it spoke again, there was recognition in the ancient voice, and something that might have been amusement. "Blood of the old kings," it said, each word falling like stones into still water. "You carry the scent of those who bound me before. How fitting that their descendant should be the one to free me now." The revelation hit the villagers like a physical blow. Eydor, common-born Eydor, son of a simple warrior, carried royal blood. The implications rippled through the defenders, ranks changing how they looked at the exile, who had seemed to bring only doom. But there was no time to process this new information. The crown-bearer raised its arms, and the assembled dead resumed their advance with renewed coordination. They moved now not as individual revenants, but as a proper army, with flanking maneuvers and tactical precision that spoke of an intelligence guiding their actions. "Fall back to the Great Hall," Astrid commanded. "We cannot hold the outer village against such numbers." The fighting retreat was chaotic but effective. The villagers had grown up hearing stories of their ancestors' battles, and some of that tactical knowledge served them well. They used the narrow spaces between buildings to break up the dead's formations, set fires to create barriers, and made every step cost their enemies dearly. Young Kari's pendant blazed brighter as they approached the great hall, its protective light now clearly visible to all. Whatever power had awakened in the simple wooden carving was growing stronger, responding to the presence of so much supernatural energy. Inside the hall, the villagers barricaded the doors and prepared for a siege, but everyone knew this was only a temporary refuge. The dead did not tire, did not hunger, did not despair. They would wait outside these walls until the defenders' strength failed, and then they would add fresh corpses to their ranks. "There has to be another way," Eydor said, staring out through a gap in the shuttered windows at the army that surrounded them. "Some weakness we can exploit." Astrid nodded grimly, her sight stone revealing layer upon layer of supernatural energy binding the horde together. "There is. But first, you need to understand the truth about what you've inherited and what it will cost to use it." In the flickering light of the great hall's fire, Astrid drew forth an object that made every person present draw back in instinctive fear. The blood-sealed dagger was a thing of ancient power and terrible beauty, its blade forged from star iron that had fallen from the sky in the time of the first kings, its handle carved from the horn of some creature that had walked the earth when magic still flowed freely through the world. Dark stains marked the blade, stains that no amount of cleaning had ever removed. They were the remnants of the original binding ritual, the lifeblood of heroes who had given everything to stop Grimvar's reign of terror 8 centuries ago. "My family has kept this secret for 30 generations, Astrid said, her voice heavy with the weight of inherited responsibility. "We are the daughters of Sigrid the Farseer, she who spoke the words that bound, the death-crowned. Each of us has been taught the ritual, prepared for the day when the binding might fail." Eydor stared at the dagger, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "The price of the binding," he said quietly. "It requires a willing sacrifice of a warrior's life force." "More than that," Astrid corrected. "It requires the blood of someone who carries the old king's lineage, blood that resonates with the same power that originally defeated Grimvar. Without it, the binding cannot hold." The implications hit the gathered villagers like hammer blows. They looked at Eydor with new understanding, not just as the cause of their troubles, but as the only possible solution. The exile who had brought doom upon them was also the only one who could save them, but only at the cost of his own life. Bjorn was the first to speak, his voice rough with emotion. "So be it then. A life for a village, that's a fair trade." But young Carrie pushed through the crowd of adults, her pendant glowing brighter as she moved closer to the ancient dagger. "No," she cried, her child's voice cutting through the resigned murmurs of agreement. "There has to be another way. He saved me. He can't die now." The pendant's light pulsed, and for a moment everyone in the hall could feel something, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed moments before. Whatever power lived in the simple wooden carving was responding to the child's desperate hope. Astrid studied the pendant with new interest, her sight stone revealing layers of magic she hadn't noticed before. "Where did you get this, child?" "My grandmother made it," Carrie said, clutching the pendant protectively. "She said it was just a tree carving, but it started glowing when the bad things came." "Your grandmother," Astrid repeated slowly. "What was her name?" "Runa, Grandmother Runa. She died last winter, but she used to tell me stories about the old days, about magic and heroes, and—" Astrid's face went pale. "Runa the root singer. I should have known." She looked at the pendant with new respect. "Child, your grandmother was more than a simple woodcarver. She was one of the last who remembered the old ways, who could speak to the spirits that live in growing things. This pendant isn't just a carving, it's a link to the life force of the forest itself." Outside the hall, the sound of splintering wood announced that the dead had begun their assault on the barricades. The villagers had maybe an hour before the defenses failed completely. "The binding ritual," Eydor said, forcing himself to focus on what mattered most. "Tell me what must be done." Astrid hesitated, glancing at young Kari before continuing. "The dagger must pierce the heart of Grimvar's power source while the binding words are spoken. But it's not his physical form that must be destroyed. It's the anchor that ties his spirit to this world. That anchor is growing stronger with each moment, feeding on the death energy of his undead army. And where do I find this anchor?" "Wherever he chooses to make his final stand," Astrid replied. "Grimvar was always a king first, a sorcerer second. He'll want a throne, a place of power from which to rule. Most likely, he'll return to the site of his original defeat, the great burial mound where the first binding took place." The thought of facing the sorcerer king on his own chosen ground was daunting, but Eydor had accepted worse odds before. "Then that's where I'll go. Teach me the words, give me the dagger, and I'll finish what I started." But as Astrid began to explain the ritual's requirements, a commotion near the hall's main door interrupted her. Several villagers had been keeping watch through the barricades, and now they called out in voices tight with fear. "Something's happening out there. The dead, they're not attacking anymore." Everyone rushed to the windows, peering through gaps in the shutters to see what had changed. The army of the undead still surrounded the hall, but they had stopped their assault. Instead, they stood in perfect formation, facing outward as if guarding against some new threat. From the forest came the sound of approaching horses, not the wild ponies that roamed the northern forests, but proper war horses with iron shoes and jingling harness. A horn sounded in the distance, its clear note cutting through the supernatural silence that had fallen over the land. "Riders," Bjorn said, squinting through the shutters. "A full warband by the sound of it." But when the newcomers emerged from the tree line, it became clear that this was no rescue. The riders were dead, ancient cavalry from some long-forgotten battle, their mounts nothing but bone and shadow, held together by the same dark magic that animated their masters. At their head rode a figure that made even the crown-bearer look small by comparison. This new arrival wore armor that had once been magnificent, plate and mail worked with gold and silver, a helm crowned with the antlers of some great stag. But time and death had claimed their toll. The armor was green with age, the gold tarnished black, and where the rider's face should have been, only darkness showed beneath the antlered helm. When this figure spoke, its voice carried the authority of absolute command. "Bring me the one who opened the prison," it commanded in the old tongue. "Bring me the blood of kings, that I might reclaim what was stolen from me." Grimvar the Death-Crowned had found himself a more suitable vessel. The antlered figure dismounted from its skeletal steed with the fluid grace of a predator, and the moment its feet touched the ground, every living thing within 100 paces felt the weight of its presence. Flowers withered in their beds. Grass turned brown and brittle. Even the mighty oak trees that had stood for centuries began to shed their leaves as if winter had arrived in a single heartbeat. But it was young Kari who felt the change most acutely. Her pendant blazed with sudden, painful intensity, the wooden carving growing so hot against her chest that she cried out and stumbled backward. The simple tree design began to change before everyone's eyes. The carved lines deepened, new branches appeared, and tiny leaves seemed to sprout from the wood itself. The spirit-touched pendant, Astrid breathed, her sight stone, revealing the true nature of what they were witnessing. It's awakening fully. The child has become a conduit for the forest's own defense against this corruption. Through her connection to the pendant, Kari could see things the others could not. The approaching dead weren't just animated corpses. They were hollow vessels filled with fragments of Grimvar's malevolent spirit. And there, beneath the antlered helm of their leader, she glimpsed something that made her young heart freeze with terror. Grimvar's true face looked back at her, not the rotted skull of the dead warrior he possessed, but the living visage of the sorcerer king, as he had been in the moment of his first death. Handsome in a terrible way, with eyes like chips of winter ice, and a smile that promised suffering beyond imagination. "I can see him," Kari whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching doom. "The real him. He's looking right at me." The connection worked both ways. Grimvar's attention fixed on the child with interest that quickly became recognition. Through the pendant's glow, he could sense the forest magic that flowed through her, magic that might prove useful to his plans. "Interesting," he mused, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. The blood of kings and the heart of the forest, both gathered in one place. Perhaps this awakening was not mere chance after all. Eydor positioned himself between Kari and the windows, his protective instincts overriding any thought of his own safety. "Stay behind me, little one. Whatever happens, stay close." But even as he spoke the words, he knew they might be meaningless. How do you protect a child from an enemy who commands armies of the dead? How do you stand against a foe who has had 8 centuries to plan his revenge? Astrid was teaching him the binding ritual as quickly as she could, speaking the ancient words slowly so he could memorize their pronunciation. The language felt strange on his tongue, older than Old Norse, older than any human speech he knew. These were words from the time before time, when the gods still walked among mortals, and magic flowed as freely as water. "Remember," she said urgently, "the words must be spoken with absolute conviction. Doubt will break the binding before it can form. Fear will turn the magic against you. You must believe, truly believe, that you have the right and the power to command Grimvar's spirit back to its prison." "And if I don't?" Eydor asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Then his power will flow through you instead of into the dagger." You'll become his vessel, and everything we've fought to protect will be lost. The responsibility was staggering. Not just the lives of the villagers, but potentially every living soul in the Northlands depended on his ability to perform a ritual he'd learned minutes ago, using magic he didn't understand, against an enemy who had been practicing the dark arts since before his ancestors were born. Outside, Grimvar had begun organizing his forces with the tactical brilliance that had once made him the most feared warlord of his age. The shambling dead formed into precise ranks, their movements coordinated with military precision. Ancient siege engines materialized from shadow and bone, catapults that hurled burning skulls instead of stones, battering rams carved from the ribs of giants. But it was the messages that began arriving that truly revealed the scope of the threat they faced. Ravens landed on the hall's roof, not living birds, but creatures of shadow and bone that served as Grimvar's messengers. They brought word from across the region. Other villages had fallen. Their populations either fled or added to the growing army of the dead. Ironhold, where Eydor's own clan had once dwelled, was among the fallen. The news hit him like a physical blow, even though his exile meant he had no love left for his former kinsmen. Whatever wrongs had passed between them, they didn't deserve the fate that Grimvar offered. "How long do we have?" Bjorn asked, checking the barricades for the 100th time. "Not long," Astrid replied, consulting omens that only she could read. "The longer Grimvar remains in the physical world, the stronger he becomes. Already his influence spreads faster than a plague. By tomorrow's dawn, he'll command every corpse within 50 miles. Eydor made his decision. "Then I go tonight. Now, while there's still a chance." "Alone?" Bjorn shook his head. "That's madness. You'll never reach the burial mound alive. His forces will cut you down before you get halfway there. I have to try. Every moment we wait makes him stronger and our chances smaller." But Kari stepped forward, her pendant now glowing so brightly it cast shadows on the walls. "Not alone," she said with the quiet determination that only children can muster. "Grandmother Runa taught me things, ways to speak to the trees, to ask the forest for help. If we're going to the old burial ground, I can guide you through paths the dead won't expect." "Absolutely not," Eydor said immediately. "I won't put a child in such danger." "The danger is already here," Kari replied, gesturing toward the windows where the sounds of supernatural siege engines could be heard. "And I'm the only one who can see the safe paths through the forest magic. Without me, you'll never make it to the mound." Astrid studied the child with her sightstone, seeing the threads of power that connected the pendant to every living thing in the forest. She's right. The forest itself is awakening to oppose Grimvar's corruption. Through her connection to it, she could guide you along routes that his dead servants cannot follow. The plan was desperate, dangerous, and probably doomed to failure. But it was the only chance they had. The escape from the Great Hall came at the cost of 3 lives, good men who threw themselves at the undead, guards to create a distraction, while Eydor and Kari slipped out through the root cellar's hidden exit. Their sacrifice weighed heavily on Eydor's heart as he and the child made their way through the dark forest. Following paths that only she could see, Kari's pendant had become their lifeline, its glow revealing routes through the woods that seemed to exist in spaces between the physical world and something else entirely. Trees bent aside to let them pass, roots formed bridges over treacherous streams, and always there was the sense of ancient intelligence guiding their steps. "The forest remembers," Kari whispered, as they paused to rest beside a spring that bubbled up from the earth like liquid starlight. "Grandmother Runa said it remembers everything, every battle, every death, every binding of power. It knows why we're here." They had been traveling for perhaps 2 hours when they reached the edge of the old battlefield, where Grimvar had first been defeated. The ground here was different, scarred by ancient magic, marked by struggles that had reshaped the very landscape. Broken weapons still jutted from the earth like iron flowers, and the bones of long-dead warriors gleamed white in the moonlight. At the battlefield's center rose the great burial mound, larger than a ship's hull, and crowned with standing stones that predated any human settlement in the region. This was where the first kings had been laid to rest, where the binding ritual had originally taken place, and where Grimvar now sat upon a throne built from the bones of his enemies. The throne itself was a nightmare made manifest, constructed from the skeletal remains of everyone who had ever opposed him. Their bones fused together by dark magic into a seat of absolute dominion. Grimvar, still wearing the antlered helm that marked his temporary vessel, sat upon this monument to his cruelty, with the casual ease of a man born to rule. But it was what lay before the throne that made Eydor's blood run. Cold, a massive shield of polished metal rested against the mound's base, its surface reflecting not the world as it was, but as it truly existed beneath all illusions and pretenses. The soul mirror shield showed the essential nature of everything it looked upon, stripping away flesh and bone and costume to reveal the spirit beneath. And in that mirror, Eydor saw himself as he truly was. The reflection that stared back at him wore not the rough clothes of an exile, but the rich robes and golden circlet of royalty. Ancient symbols of power marked his brow, and around him swirled the ghostly forms of dozens of long-dead kings, his ancestors, all of them, stretching back through the centuries to the very first ruler who had claimed dominion over these lands. "Blood of the old kings," Grimvar said, his voice carrying easily across the battlefield. "I wondered when you would recognize what you truly are. Your bloodline reaches back to Sigurd the First Crown, does it not? The king who first bound me to mortal flesh, who made it possible for his descendants to challenge my power." The revelation hit Eydor like a physical blow. Not just royal blood, he was the direct descendant of the king who had originally defeated Grimvar, the exile who had spent years believing himself worthless. Abandoned by his clan for a single failure, carried within his veins the most royal bloodline in all the Northlands. "I don't understand," he said, though part of him, the part that had always felt different, always felt called to something greater, understood perfectly. "Your clan knew," Grimvar continued with obvious amusement. "The Iron Wolves have always known which of their members carried the true blood. They've spent generations hiding you among common warriors, diluting the royal line to keep it safe from those who might seek to exploit it." Images flashed through Eydor's mind, moments from his childhood that suddenly made sense. His father's strange insistence on certain lessons, his mother's stories about the old kings that had seemed more like family history than legend. The way certain elders had looked at him with something that might have been fear or reverence. "The disgrace that led to your exile," Grimvar went on, his voice taking on a tone of false sympathy. "Was it really failure? Or was it an excuse to remove you from a position where others might begin to notice your true nature?" The possibility was like a dagger to the heart. Had his banishment been orchestrated? Had Tormund's death been allowed to happen because the clan leaders feared what Eydor might become if he ever learned the truth about his heritage? Carrie's pendant blazed brighter, responding to the emotional turmoil radiating from her companion. Through its connection to the forest, she could feel the shift in the spiritual landscape, power calling to power, destiny reshaping itself around this moment of revelation. "It doesn't matter what they did or why," she said firmly, her young voice cutting through Eydor's confusion. "What matters is what you choose to do now." Her words brought him back to the present, to the immediate crisis that threatened everyone he cared about. Royal blood or common? He was still the man who had opened Grimvar's prison. He was still responsible for setting this evil free, but now he understood why the binding ritual could work without requiring his death. The royal bloodline didn't just give him the right to command Grimvar's spirit, it gave him the power to contain it. Where the original binding had required multiple warriors to sacrifice their lives, a true heir of the royal line could channel enough power alone to complete the ritual. "You begin to understand," Grimvar said, rising from his bone throne with fluid grace. "You have the power to bind me, yes, but you also have the power to command me. Think of what we could accomplish together. Think of the empire we could build. The temptation was real and terrible, With Grimvar's knowledge and his own royal authority, Eydor could indeed build an empire. He could reclaim his place among his clan, force them to acknowledge what they had hidden from him. He could punish those who had wronged him, reward those who had shown him kindness. He could have everything he had ever wanted. But then he looked at Kari, brave, innocent Kari, who had guided him here through paths of magic and moonlight, and remembered what truly mattered. Not power or revenge or recognition, but the simple duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. "I understand perfectly," Eydor said, drawing the blood-sealed dagger from his belt. "I understand that some prices are too high to pay, no matter what they might buy." Grimvar's amusement faded, replaced by the cold fury of a tyrant denied. "So be it then. If you will not rule beside me, you will serve me in death." The sorcerer king raised his hands, and every bone on the ancient battlefield began to move. The ancient battlefield erupted into chaos as bones that had lain quiet for centuries answered their master's call. Ribcages reassembled themselves into grotesque spiders that skittered across the scarred earth. Femurs and tibias fused together into serpentine horrors that slithered between the standing stones. Skulls rolled like boulders, their empty sockets blazing with cold fire as they sought targets for their master's wrath. Eydor grabbed Kari's hand and pulled her toward the burial mound itself, where the standing stones offered some protection from the tide of animated bones. The child's pendant had grown so bright it was painful to look at directly, its light seeming to hold back the worst of Grimvar's creations through sheer force of natural vitality. "The binding words," Eydor shouted over the clatter and scrape of moving bone. "Tell me again, exactly as they must be spoken." Kari closed her eyes, her connection to the forest revealing knowledge that had been passed down through generations of wise women. "Astrid showed me," she said, her voice strangely calm despite the chaos around them. "The words are carved into the roots of the world tree itself. I can see them." As she spoke, the ancient phrases flowed from her lips in perfect old tongue pronunciation. But more than that, Eydor could see the power behind the words, threads of golden light that connected the syllables to the very foundations of reality. The royal blood in his veins resonated with each phrase, teaching him not just how to speak them, but how to mean them. By the crown of the first king, by the sacrifice of the willing dead, by the authority of those who came before, the words seemed to write themselves on his memory in letters of fire. Grimvar's laughter echoed across the battlefield, rich with genuine amusement. "You think ancient words will be enough? You think the same ritual that barely contained me 8 centuries ago will prove sufficient now?" The sorcerer king gestured toward his bone throne, and the massive structure began to change. The skeletal remains that formed its base shifted and flowed like liquid, rebuilding themselves into something far more sinister. What emerged was no longer a throne but an altar, a platform designed for blood sacrifice. Its surface carved with channels that led to a central depression where something dark as a midnight pool began to form. "Behold the throne of bones in its true form," Grimvar declared. "For 800 years I have planned this moment. Every death in these lands has fed power into this altar. Every grave has become a reservoir of energy waiting for my command. The binding ritual requires a source of life force to power it. But what if I simply drain that source faster than you can channel it?" The implications were terrifying. The altar wasn't just Grimvar's seat of power. It was a massive supernatural engine designed to corrupt the binding ritual itself. Instead of sealing his spirit away, the dagger's strike would release all the death energy he had accumulated over the centuries, making him virtually unstoppable. But Eydor's royal heritage brought with it more than just the authority to command spirits. As he stared at the transformed altar, understanding flooded through him. Not his own knowledge, but the accumulated wisdom of every king who had come before him. They were there in his mind now, drawn by the awakening of his true nature, offering guidance across the centuries. His ancestor Sigurd the First Crown spoke with a voice like distant thunder. The altar's power flows from the bones of the dishonored dead. Break the foundation, and the structure cannot stand. Another voice, lighter but no less authoritative, Queen Astrid, the truth speaker. Look to the child, descendant. She carries more than forest magic. She carries hope itself, and hope is the one force that death cannot claim. A third voice, grim and practical, King Eric the Last. The throne feeds on despair and the memory of defeat. Give it victory to consume instead, and it will starve. The ghostly counsel of his ancestors filled Eydor with knowledge he had never learned, but somehow always known. The binding ritual could work, but not as originally intended. Instead of containing Grimvar through sacrifice and loss, they would have to defeat him through triumph and renewal. Kari, he said urgently, kneeling beside the child as bones continued to crash around them. Your pendant, it's not just connected to the forest. It's connected to every living thing that refuses to surrender to death. Can you reach out to them? Can you call them here? The girl's eyes widened as she understood what he was asking. You want me to wake up the whole forest? All of it. Not wake up, inspire. Show every living thing in these lands that death is not the end, that life fights back, that hope exists even in the darkest hour. It was an enormous request to make of a child, but Kari had already proven herself capable of far more than anyone had expected. She placed both hands on her pendant and reached out with her mind, following the threads of connection that linked her to every tree, every blade of grass, every creature that drew breath in the northern wilderness. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Trees throughout the forest began to move, not the slow, ponderous movement of growth, but the quick, purposeful action of creatures with will and intent. Ancient oaks pulled their roots from the earth and strode toward the battlefield like wooden giants. Birch groves flowed like silver rivers around the shambling dead. Pine trees hurled their massive cones like boulders, each one striking with the force of a catapult stone. But it wasn't just the trees that answered her call. Every living creature in the forest felt the summons. Wolves ran alongside deer they would normally hunt. Bears emerged from their dens with protective fury, and overhead, clouds of ravens and eagles darkened the sky. Even the stones themselves seemed to respond. The ancient standing stones around the burial mound beginning to glow with the same warm light as Kari's pendant. These were not just markers. They were focuses for the same earth magic that had originally helped bind Grimvar centuries ago. For the first time since awakening, Grimvar showed genuine concern. Impossible, he snarled, his composure cracking. The forest magic was bound by the same ritual that contained me. It should be as weak as morning mist. That was before, Eydor replied, feeling the power of his royal heritage flowing through him like molten gold. Before an innocent child chose to believe that life is stronger than death. Before the forest itself decided to fight back. He drew the blood-sealed dagger, and its ancient blade caught the light from Kari's pendant, reflecting it back in patterns that seemed to write themselves across the air. The weapon was responding to his royal blood, awakening capabilities that had lain dormant since the original binding. But Grimvar was not finished. With a roar of fury that shook the very foundations of the burial mound, he abandoned his temporary vessel and revealed his true form, not the decayed corpse of an ancient king, but a towering figure of shadow and bone, wrapped in robes that seemed to be cut from the darkness between stars. "If I cannot rule through corruption," he declared, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute malevolence, "then I will rule through destruction. I will tear down the barriers between life and death, between order and chaos. I will remake this world as a charnel house where I am the only law." The throne of bones pulsed with gathered power, ready to release 8 centuries of accumulated death energy in one devastating wave. But as it prepared to unleash its fury, something unexpected happened. From deep within the burial mound came a new sound, not the groaning of the dead, but something far more powerful. It was the sound of an ancient horn being blown, its clear note cutting through the supernatural chaos like a blade through cloth. The ancestral war horn was calling, and the spirits of every true king who had ever ruled these lands were answering its summons. The ancestral war horn's call split the night like a blade of pure sound, and from the depths of the burial mound came answers that made the very earth tremble. Ghostly figures emerged from the ancient stones, not shambling corpses animated by dark magic, but the proud spirits of kings who had ruled with wisdom and died with honor. Sigurd the First Crown came first, his spectral form blazing with the authority that had united the scattered clans into a single kingdom. Behind him strode Queen Astrid the Truth Speaker, her phantom crown glowing with the light of justice itself. Eric the Last followed, bearing the scars of the final battle that had saved his people at the cost of his own life. They were all there, 30 generations of royal blood stretching back to the dawn of recorded history. Each spirit carried the echoes of their greatest deeds, their noblest sacrifices, their unbreakable commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. Eydor felt their presence like a surge of power through his veins. This was his true inheritance, not gold or land or title, but the accumulated wisdom and strength of everyone who had worn the crown before him. The royal blood that his clan had hidden for so long now revealed its true purpose. "Stand with us, descendant," Sigurd commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Take up the crown that was always meant to be yours." From the ethereal forms of his ancestors came a circlet of pure light, not gold or silver, but something far more precious. This was the crown of the just, forged from the willing sacrifices of those who had given everything to protect the innocent. It settled on Eydor's brow with the weight of destiny itself. The moment the crown touched his head, everything changed. The battlefield became clear to him in ways that transcended mere sight. He could see the threads of power that connected every living thing, the flows of magic that bound the world together, the fundamental forces that Grimvar sought to corrupt. Most importantly, he could see the true nature of the Throne of Bones. The altar wasn't just drawing power from the accumulated deaths of centuries, it was feeding on something deeper. It consumed the very concept of endings, the natural cycle that allowed new life to replace the old. If Grimvar succeeded in his plan, nothing would ever truly die, but nothing would ever truly live either. The forest army that Kari had summoned crashed into Grimvar's forces like a tide of living wood and fury. Ancient oaks grappled with bone constructs that had terrorized the land for hours, their roots tearing apart the dark magic that held the undead together. Bears and wolves fought side by side against enemies that felt no pain, using teamwork and determination to overcome supernatural resilience. But it was the aerial battle that proved most spectacular. The ravens and eagles that had answered Kari's call weren't fighting alone. Ghostly birds flew alongside them, the spirits of creatures that had died protecting their nests, their young, their territories. Together, they formed a living storm that swept the sky clean of Grimvar's shadow servants. Eydor moved through the chaos with the fluid grace of a born warrior. But now, his movements carried the accumulated skill of every king who had ever wielded a blade. The blood-sealed dagger sang in his hand, its ancient metal eager to complete the task for which it had been forged. But Grimvar was no mere opponent. 8 centuries of accumulated power had made him something beyond mortal comprehension. Where he gestured, reality itself seemed to bend. The ground beneath his feet turned to glass, then to shadow, then to something that existed in the spaces between existing. His form shifted constantly, now a towering figure of darkness, now a swarm of biting insects, now a cold wind that carried the whispers of the damned. "You think your ancestors' ghosts can stand against me?" he roared, his voice echoing from every direction at once. "I have devoured kingdoms. I have made graveyards of empires. What are a few royal spirits to one who has conquered death itself?" The Throne of Bones pulsed with malevolent energy, and for a moment it seemed Grimvar might be right. The altar's power was immense, fed by centuries of accumulated death energy. Against such forces, even the combined might of the royal spirit seemed small. But then Kari's voice rose above the din of battle, clear and pure as spring water. She was singing, not words in any language Eydor recognized, but something older and deeper. It was the song the forest sang to itself, the melody that connected every living thing to the great web of existence. Her pendant blazed like a captured star, and suddenly the battlefield was filled with more than just the spirits of dead kings. The ghosts of everyone who had ever lived in these lands with love in their hearts appeared. Farmers who had died protecting their crops, mothers who had given their lives for their children, simple folk who had chosen hope over despair, even in their darkest hours. They came not as warriors, but as witnesses, their presence a reminder of what was truly worth fighting for. And in that moment, Eydor understood the final truth about the binding ritual. It wasn't about containing evil through sacrifice. It was about overwhelming darkness with light. The battlefield had become something beyond mortal comprehension, a place where the fundamental forces of existence clashed in their purest forms. Light and darkness, life and death, hope and despair, all fought for dominion over the ancient burial ground where kings and tyrants had been laid to rest. Eydor fought his way toward the throne of bones with supernatural grace, the crown of the just blazing on his brow like a beacon of righteous authority. Every step brought him closer to the altar where Grimvar's power was concentrated, but also closer to the terrible revelation of what the Sorcerer King had truly become. This was no longer the ambitious warlord who had once conquered kingdoms through force of arms. 8 centuries of existence as pure malevolence had transformed Grimvar into something far worse, the living embodiment of endings without meaning, death without purpose, the corruption of everything noble about the warrior's path. When Eydor finally reached the base of the mound, Grimvar descended from his throne to meet him. The Sorcerer King's true form was revealed at last, not the decayed corpse of an ancient ruler, but a figure of absolute darkness, wearing a crown made from the final breaths of everyone he had ever killed. "Look upon me and despair," Grimvar commanded, his voice carrying the weight of every life he had ended. "I am the inevitable fate of all who dare to stand against me. I am the proof that honor and justice are illusions, that only power has meaning." But Eydor had learned to see past such theatrics. Through the wisdom of his ancestors and the clarity granted by his crown, he could perceive the truth that Grimvar desperately tried to hide. Beneath all the accumulated darkness and malevolent power was something pitiful, a man so terrified of his own mortality that he had traded everything human about himself for the illusion of permanence. "You're not inevitable," Eydor replied, raising the blood-sealed dagger until its blade caught the light from Kari's pendant. "You're just afraid. 800 years of existence, and you're still the same frightened boy who couldn't accept that all things must end." The words struck Grimvar like physical blows. For the first time since his awakening, cracks appeared in his supernatural composure. "Silence! I'm deathless. I am eternal." "You're nothing," Eydor continued, pressing his advantage. "You've spent so long running from death that you've forgotten what it means to live. That's why you can't understand the binding ritual. It was never about containing you through force. It was about showing you what you've chosen to sacrifice." Their weapons met with a sound like thunder, but this was more than mere combat. The blood-sealed dagger carried within its ancient metal the willing sacrifice of heroes who had given their lives to protect others. Grimvar's blade, forged from the crystallized despair of his victims, represented the exact opposite philosophy. Where they clashed, reality itself seemed to bend and reshape. The very concept of what it meant to choose between life and death was being fought out in steel and sorcery. But even as Eydor fought with skill that transcended mortal limitations, he knew that physical combat alone would not be enough. The true battle was taking place on a deeper level, in the realm of spirit and will, where Grimvar's accumulated power seemed overwhelming. That was when Kari's pendant revealed its final secret. The heart of winter, Grimvar's preserved essence, the source of his immortality, wasn't hidden in some distant stronghold or protected by layers of dark magic. It was right there, beating like a frozen drum at the center of the throne of bones. The child's connection to the forest had allowed her to see what others could not, that Grimvar's heart had been transformed into a thing of supernatural ice, its chambers filled not with blood, but with the crystallized tears of everyone who had ever mourned his victims. It was both the source of his power and his greatest vulnerability. "There," Gary cried, her voice somehow carrying clearly over the sounds of battle. "His heart, it's in the throne. The pendant shows me the way." The spirit-touched pendant blazed like a star as it revealed the hidden pathways through Grimvar's defenses. Where normal sight showed only bone and shadow, Carrie could see the threads of life force that connected the Sorcerer King to his frozen heart. More importantly, she could see how to sever those connections. Understanding flooded through Eydor like lightning. The binding ritual didn't require him to defeat Grimvar in combat. It required him to free the Sorcerer King from the prison of his own making. The Heart of Winter wasn't just Grimvar's source of power. It was the cage that had trapped him in an existence without meaning for 8 centuries. With a surge of movement that combined his own skill with the accumulated wisdom of 30 generations of kings, Eydor broke past Grimvar's defenses and drove the blood-sealed dagger toward its true target, not the Sorcerer King's physical form, but the frozen heart that had become his eternal torment. The moment the ancient blade pierced the Heart of Winter, everything changed. The moment the blood-sealed dagger pierced the Heart of Winter, the world held its breath. For 8 centuries, Grimvar's frozen essence had beat with the steady rhythm of accumulated malevolence, each pulse sending waves of corruption through the land. Now, as the ancient blade broke through the crystallized despair that had sustained him, that terrible heartbeat finally stopped. What followed was not the explosion of dark energy that everyone expected, but something far more profound. The Heart of Winter cracked like an eggshell, and from within poured not darkness but light, the accumulated tears of grief that had been frozen there for centuries, now released to flow freely once more. Grimvar's towering form of shadow and bone began to dissolve, but his face, as it faded, was not twisted with rage or hatred. Instead, for the first time in 800 years, the Sorcerer King looked peaceful, human, mortal. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice no longer carrying the weight of supernatural malevolence, but sounding like that of a tired old man finally allowed to rest. "I had forgotten what it felt like to choose to end." The spectral armies that had terrorized the land crumbled to dust as their animating force was released. But they did not simply vanish. Instead, they dissolved into points of light that rose toward the stars, like freed spirits finally allowed to continue their interrupted journeys. The ancient dead were at peace again, their rest no longer disturbed by the will of one who had refused to accept his own mortality. The throne of bones collapsed in on itself, its structure of suffering and despair unable to maintain coherence without the Heart of Winter to sustain it. Where it had stood, the earth began to heal. Grass sprouted from soil that had been barren for centuries, and flowers bloomed in patterns that seemed to mirror the constellations above. Kari's pendant gradually dimmed to its normal soft glow, but the child herself seemed somehow changed by the experience. The connection she had forged with the forest spirit remained, a permanent bridge between the world of humans and the older magic that flowed through root and branch. She would grow up to become something new, not just a wise woman like her grandmother, but a guardian of the balance between civilization and the wild. The crown of the just settled more firmly on Eydor's brow, no longer a burden of destiny, but a comfortable weight of accepted responsibility. He was a king now, not because he had claimed a throne through conquest, but because he had proven himself worthy of the trust that leadership required. The first to acknowledge this change was Bjorn, who had survived the siege of the Great Hall and arrived at the battlefield just as the supernatural forces were fading away. The massive blacksmith knelt on the blood-soaked ground, his weathered face showing a mixture of wonder and newfound respect. "Your Majesty," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of absolute sincerity. One by one, the other villagers who had survived the night followed suit, not out of fear or obligation, but from genuine recognition of what Eydor had become. They had seen him sacrifice everything, his safety, his anonymity, even his life if necessary, to protect people who had once cast him out. But Eydor's first act as their acknowledged king was to raise them all to their feet. "Stand," he said gently. "We are all equals in the morning light. Leadership is not about elevation, it's about service." The days that followed brought a slow but steady restoration of normal life to the region. Messages were sent to the scattered survivors of other villages, inviting them to return and rebuild. The unnatural winter that had settled over the land broke like a fever, replaced by the gentle warmth of true spring. Astrid took Carrie as her apprentice, but this would be a different kind of training than the old wise woman had received. The child's connection to the forest spirit would need careful guidance, and new traditions would need to be established. To ensure such a balance between human and natural magic could be maintained for future generations, the rebuilding of Skjoldholt became a symbol of hope throughout the Northlands. Where once had stood a simple farming village, now rose a true settlement, not a grand city, but a place where people could live in harmony, with both the natural world and the deeper mysteries that flowed beneath the surface of everyday life. Eydor established his court not in a palace, but in a great hall built around the ancient oak where Carrie had first spoken to the forest spirits. The crown of the just was displayed there, not as a symbol of royal authority, but as a reminder that true leadership comes from willing service to others. Years passed. The story of the Death Crown's binding became legend, told around fires on winter nights when the wind howled and children needed reminding that even the greatest darkness could be overcome by courage and compassion. But those who had lived through those terrible days knew it was more than just a story. It was proof that redemption was always possible, that exile could become homecoming, that even the deepest loneliness could be transformed into connection. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the village settled into peaceful rest, Eydor would sometimes walk to the shores of Lake Vargskinn. The water was clear now, free of the supernatural ice that had once gripped it. Fish swam in its depths, and children played safely along its banks. He would stand there and remember the man he had been, bitter, alone, convinced that his life held no meaning beyond the weight of his failures. That man felt like a stranger now, though Eydor carried no resentment toward his former self. That exile's loneliness and desperation had led him to the frozen chest. And without that moment of curiosity and need, none of the good that followed would have been possible. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the strangest packages. Sometimes the very mistakes that seem to doom us become the foundations for something better than we ever dared imagine. And sometimes, when the ice breaks and the light pours out, we discover that what we thought was an ending was really just the beginning of the story we were always meant to live.